This is Perth Tonight with Chris Ilsley on 882 6PR, the voice of Perth.
Let's ask that question, should there be more drug testing in our community? Now, I should point out that there are some experts who believe that by making drug testing the norm, it could prove a deterrent to young people. Sort of somebody being offered, let's say, for example, some drug or other. Nah, can't do that, mate, because I've got to have a drug test, or I don't know when it's coming up next. Might get caught out. Dale Kennett is a forensic HR specialist. Before we go any further, thanks very much for having a chat to us, Dale, but I've got to ask you, my friend, what is a forensic HR specialist?
It's about looking into the policies that an organisation has, because obviously people, and especially if we look at drugs and alcohol, employees seem to think that the company would just pop a policy, oh, yeah, we've got this drug and alcohol policy, oh, there's a drug tester today, oh, I've just been caught, they've been dismissed. The Fair Work Commission wouldn't look favourably at that. So I look at businesses' policies, how to improve it, so that way, if they're looking at using their policies to go down the way of dismissing staff, that the policies are going to be right and fair for both the employee and the employer. So
what you're also suggesting is that in the first instance, you make sure that the policy is in fact lawful.
Correct.
That makes a lot of sense. Drug testing. It's one of these things that's controversial, especially when it comes, for example, to drugs like marijuana, which we know can linger in the system for a long time. Somebody can decide to indulge in a toke and have a drug test 3 weeks down the track and it can be detected. Some people would argue that, okay, a person who hasn't had any dope for 3 weeks is clearly not going to be affected by drugs, but they're liable to test positive in a drug test. So then we have the logical question, is that fair?
You have to really look at the Australian legislation, because legislation sets the limits of what is allowed in the system. It's not really always the employer. So legislation turns around and says, well, you can't have this amount of this substance in your system. If you do, you're breaking the law.
But what it does do, even if you had what might be called a permissible amount in your system, it still highlights the fact that you're smoking dope. Now, that's the kind
Correct.
of stuff that if somebody is indulging, and even if they work it so there's no way they're going to fall foul of a drug test because they kind of know that they have to leave a reasonable amount of time, and even if they know they're going to fall below the limit, I guess the problem is the first thing they'd say is, yeah, but my employer would know that I like a toke now and again.
Yes, that would make it extremely difficult if the employer knows. And they haven't implemented any testing regime in the past.
Yep.
But then if they have implemented a testing regime and it's been going for a couple of months and then that person gets caught up in a random, then, yeah, it can be an area whereby that person could be dismissed.
And, of course, we have a legal minefield here, because on one side you'd have the employer saying, well, we absolutely have to make sure, especially if we have employees operating heavy machinery or doing something else, for which if it goes wrong somebody could get seriously injured or killed, the employee themselves or somebody else. There are legal implications there. So
yes.
These days, the one thing that's been obvious to me, Dale, is that employers are really gun-shy about doing anything that could potentially leave them exposed to litigation. So erring on the side of caution means we leave it out, absolutely. So the kind of push for these sort of tests, I would imagine, are going to become more frequent. I would also imagine that in some instances people are going to push back against them.
Yeah, look, some people are going to push back against them, but you've got to look at where some businesses are starting to take up drug and alcohol testing. So I was called to a new client just a couple of weeks ago. Somebody had left their organisation. I'm not quite sure if it was amicable or not. But when that person left, they've rung up WorkSafe and they've sort of said, people drink at that work site. It's unsafe. WorkSafe has gone out, investigated this organisation and have found some full cans tucked away in the kitchen cupboard, and turned around and sort of said, well, yes, based on the fact that somebody's reported that, we have found cans. We can only assume that people drink at work here. You will now have to implement a 12-month drug and alcohol program because you do have moving equipment which could harm staff here. So it comes down to it's not always just the employer.
But what happens, well, and a little bit of common sense. I mean, I could go around to your place and I might find you might have gone down to the liquor store last Friday, you've bought yourself a block of cans, they're sitting in the fridge. What I don't know about Dale is it's probably going to take him 6 months to drink them. And half of them won't be drunk by him because they'll be drunk by mates who come around as part of their social life. So I wouldn't automatically be able to go around and assume that, oh, well, Dale's going to go to work on Monday, he uses heavy machinery, and look at this, he might be affected by alcohol. So why do we make these assumptions without saying, well, okay, at some point we have to accept that people are responsible adults and they kind of get it. I mean, there's a vast difference between somebody who decides to have a beer after work and somebody who's got a drinking problem who's drinking on the job.
Yep, that is true, but it comes down to you have to go back to the regulators to sort of, and in this particular case it's WorkSafe, where you have to go back to and sort of say, how could you make such an assumption based on somebody saying that and finding some cans in a cupboard to sort of say, okay, yep, so somebody does drink on this site, but there's no real proof that it was drunk during working hours.
And not only that, it could be drunk on the site, if you want to be really technical about it, it could be drunk by somebody who doesn't have any form of responsibility. It could be drunk by somebody who's an office jockey.
Exactly. And for me, in what I do and what I see, because this WorkSafe one has been a concern for me, because it comes down to, let's talk about 6PR. Do you have a bar fridge there? Is there alcohol in that?
Yes,
there is.
Yeah.
So it means WorkSafe could go into there and sort of say, okay, well, there are 6PR staff that are driving company vehicles, and there is alcohol here. WorkSafe can come in and turn around and sort of say, well, yes, you now need to implement a drug and alcohol program here, because there are going to be staff that will be operating machinery and they can consume alcohol at work.
And nobody at any time says, well, what we're talking about here are adults who are free and over 18, so therefore they should be able to make decisions for themselves. And in fact, there is actually a responsibility for them to make decisions for themselves. I suppose in some respects, a lot of it is just about another extension of the nanny state. But what's happening is we remove, as far as I can see, we remove responsibility from people to take responsibility for themselves. And secondly, what we're also doing is we're making it so hard that no company ever wants to get involved in any of this. It just becomes too hard. But we're also doing a pretty nice job keeping a bunch of bureaucrats in a job.
Yes, it is. It does work that way. And especially when you start looking at, you had the Fair Work Building Commission mandate that if the government puts in $5 million into, this is the federal government, into a construction project, or more than $5 million, you now have to do mandatory monthly drug and alcohol testing on that contract for the period of that contract, and you've got to do 10% of the staff every month.
So now we get down to this question about whether or not, and this is where we started, drug testing should be done as a routine. What's your take on that?
I think we need to do it more, because when we're looking at the younger people coming through, the young people know that when they're under 18, they can take drugs and there's nothing can happen to them. They get it, they go to the court, they get a little fine, they move on with life. But when they turn 18, I think it's a way of trying to help. If the kids see that drug and alcohol testing is a norm in society, hopefully it will have the same positive effects as the negative impact of smoking out there in the marketplace.
Yeah, but the smoking thing was done firstly by persuasion. And once you persuaded people to a certain level, you got people to the point where they were prepared to accept greater regulation. And we also forget that when they started, the majority of people smoked, even though that's not the case now. And certainly if you talk to anyone under about 50 would sort of have trouble understanding that there was a time when the majority of people smoked.
Exactly.
Now, when we start to talk about this, the majority of people are not irresponsible drug takers who will go and drive machinery or go and try and do their job when they're stoned or drunk or whatever the case may be. So therefore what you're then doing arguably is you're treating people like idiots, which, unlike the smoking scenario, makes me wonder how it will be received in the wider community.
It's always going to be received in a negative impact. You're infringing on my personal rights to do this, to do that, and that's understandable. But also it comes down to, we do need to sort of say, how do we stop people buying drugs and taking drugs? And this is one way. Increasing the testing out there in the marketplace is one way to maybe reduce people taking drugs because of the fear of getting caught.
Do you think it'll work? It's an idea that's out there. Do you think that it will actually have the practical outcomes that they reckon it will have?
I do believe it would.
So therefore, on that basis, we should probably be arguing that there would be drug testing for just about everybody. But then, once again, who's going to pay it? And it seems to me that they come up with these ideas, then ultimately, and governments are great at coming up with these ideas, but ultimately somebody else has to fund it, usually employers. So it's another expense that goes on business. It's an expense that's going to be passed on to people. People are already trying to find ways to reduce their expenses. It might, could be a true swings and roundabout scenario, Dale. Positive in one area, but not so much in another.
Yeah, but you don't have, if each business did their own little bit, they don't have to do it quite heavily. You could just test one or two people a month to start going through the program. It's starting somewhere and having something being implemented so that people know, well, you know what? Yeah, I get a job there, I'm going to be tested. If I get a job there, I'm going to be tested. If I get a job there, I'm going to be tested.
And you think it will be successful? You think that's enough for a lot of people?
The people over 25 years of age, I do believe so.
Okay. So you think once people have got a couple of years under their belt, but then once you get over 25, you're probably also reducing the number of people who are probably inclined to take drugs anyway, aren't you? Unless they become problem drug takers, in which case the chances are they can't hold down a job anyway.
Exactly. But, from my experience in the welfare side of when I've worked in welfare looking after alcoholic, drug addicts, psychotic and homeless men, it's once people start getting to that 25 age bracket where they start making conscious life decisions to them moving forward and sort of saying, well, no, bugger it, I don't want to take that substance anymore. I don't want to do that anymore. I want this. These are my new goals for my life, and this is what I'm going to achieve.
All right, Dale. Been a pleasure and an enlightening discussion. I appreciate that.
Anytime, Chris.
Dale Kennett is an HR specialist. Well, actually, I should get his title right. He's a forensic HR specialist.